Okay, well, I wasn't exactly planning on making this video. I mentioned that I would in my Night Rain analysis video, and a comment on that video that got 3 likes asked me to do it, so that's more than enough for me. So let's start taking apart these bosses, starting with Gladius. And his base moveset is going to be a lot of single hit bite attacks in a lot of different ways, such as this dashing one and the double dash, which ends in a jumping slam, all of which is pretty straightforward and well telegraphed. Then there's also a standing still version, which I believe is the same attack as his dashing one, and then also a headbutt version, which all pretty much work exactly the same. You should be able to easily read the telegraph on the majority of them and dodge accordingly. However, there is also a double hit, which starts with a biting attack and then ends with a slam move, and that might catch you off guard if you're not ready for it. And there's also what looks like a 4-hit attack, but really it's just 2 separate instances, one where 2 heads bite and then one where 3 heads bite. You can pretty easily back dodge that twice. Now, getting into his chain moves, we have this move here, which starts with a bite and then one head subtly bites onto the sword while that animation is playing out. So that way, when they jump back, the sword carries its momentum into a delayed, kind of tricky slice. Moving on to the rest of his chain moves, there's one that is a single hit of damage, where he raises the sword very high into the air and drops it down. It's pretty easy to avoid, but after activating phase 2, the boss will have a secondary move where it jumps into the air, does a spin, and then slams the sword into the ground, which again is pretty easy and straightforward to avoid. It's kind of just a small AoE at the point of the sword, and it's pretty easy to avoid. Next, there's a 2-hit combo, where the sword swings back and forth. You'll notice that a good telegraph for this is that the sword remains somewhat horizontal while it's midair, and you can use that to recognize that the 2-hit combo is incoming. This chain move does not have a follow-up in phase 2. Now, the next chain move is an independent variant of the chain move that followed a bite attack, where it looks like a double swing, but in reality, at least based on the footage that I have, it looks as though the initial swing of the sword would not hit me, and I only had to worry about the delayed follow-up. This attack will also get a follow-up in phase 2, which is the headbutt move, which will be easy to avoid as long as you remember it's about to happen. Now, onto his special style moves. The most obvious one is going to be his fire breath, which isn't necessarily telegraphed all that well. You kind of have to know it's coming, see the fire in his mouth, and then dodge accordingly based on your own internal clock, because by the time the fire has spawned, you've already taken the damage. Next, there's his grab move, which I've never actually been grabbed by. He's never actually done it nearby me enough to make it much of a threat, but if you were close enough, you could dodge through it to activate the grab move mechanic, if you wish to do that. Now, there's also the gimmick of this fight, in which the boss splits into 3 separate wolves, which each teammate will hopefully have one to fight, but if you're fighting solo, that makes it a lot more difficult. Honestly, my strategy for this move is just to avoid the little fireballs that they turn into, which deals kind of a lot of damage, considering how subtle it is, and then just run away for the majority of this phase. It's not worth the damage you're going to take. Now, lastly, there's his ultimate, which is a wave of fire that spawns at his sword, and this too is arguably not a very good telegraph. The fire is a wave, and therefore the farther you are away from it, the more delayed it is. And this is going to be a reoccurring theme within the Nightlord fights. Many attacks don't look like waves at all, but they are, very subtly so. And so you do want to dodge almost immediately as the attack is coming, but at the same time, if your nerves get the best of you, you'll dodge early and take the damage of the wave of fire. But that pretty much wraps up Gladius. Pretty simple, easy fight, and I honestly feel embarrassed that I struggled with it at first. Moving on to Adel, who has a lot more move diversity than Gladius did. To start, we have this sliding mouth attack, where he'll open his mouth wide and move across the arena, which he can sometimes do while you're near him and has kind of an awkward hitbox. Next, there's a single slam attack with his head, which is pretty rare. Kind of caught me off guard to see it when taking apart the moveset to make this video. At first I thought he just animation canceled, but it is part of his moveset. Next, there's a double bite attack that you'll see frequently, and you'll want to get the timing down quite well. However, besides just knowing the timing of the 2 attacks, in order to efficiently deal with this move, you should learn to dodge through the first attack while close enough, and then begin attacking the boss yourself, allowing yourself to hit him in the leg, and then hopefully with a jump attack, having a weapon where your hitbox will hit his tail as he moves away from you. Next, he has another double attack, this time telegraphed by him spinning his body like this, and it has pretty much the same timing as his first 2-hit attack, although this move gets powered up in his phase 2 with extra lightning damage, I believe an AoE. And lastly, within his basic melee moveset, he has a triple bite attack, which again is super rare, and I'm not sure if it's a phase 2 only move, but I only saw it this one time in my footage. Definitely caught me off guard. The telegraph for this move seems to be him opening his mouth wide and almost painfully before unleashing an attack, a delay, and then 2 attacks. The next facet of this boss fight involves his weakness to poison, which, once triggered within phase 1, will have him vomit up a poisonous puddle. Definitely don't be afraid to attempt to damage on this if you can identify it coming after having triggered the poison in phase 1. You can hit his legs pretty safely and easily, and it's a huge source of free damage. Next we have his grab attack, which is one of his most notorious moves. You'll want to time your dodge after he's put his head on the ground and just as he starts moving towards you, especially so if you want to get the perfect dodge grab mechanic bonus. However, if you even want to push your limits further, I would recommend that you back dodge on his grab, which allows you an opening on this move much more consistently, being that you're considerably closer to him. This will still activate the perfect dodge, but your timing will have to be tighter. Now next, let's talk about his head slam moves. Starting with the single head slam, that will be telegraphed by his head reeling back quite hard to distinguish between the single hit and not. Both of these get upgraded pretty severely in phase 2, adding a secondary jumpable after effect onto each one of his slams, which is very simple on his single hit, but with the triple hit, it makes it so that a ton is going on. And I would highly recommend that if you're in front of him, you make distance to dodge this attack. However, if you're behind him, you can kind of keep up with him and deal damage on the final hit with a jump attack. Now you'll want to be careful when you're in front of him, because each one of his attacks bringing his head back up is a hitbox of damage, and so he'll often knock you out of your jumps if you attempt to jump over the after effects and you're too close to him. There's not a lot of engagement reward for dealing with this move, so you should probably just play it safe and avoid the damage. Now onto his more special moves, we have one that's very subtle. He starts with this roaring attack, and then goes into some more basic moves, such as this walking animation, which doesn't deal damage as far as I'm aware, but you'll want to go through in order to trigger him to jump attack into you, which is a small opening that is sometimes followed up by a double grab move, however sometimes is not. This can be a pretty good source of damage, especially if you space yourself to know where his first jump attack is going to land and to be close enough to get a couple of hits in. And if you're lucky on your spacing, you can get 2 of the perfect dodge grab moves on the following attack. However, it is not always triggered. The first 2 attacks in this combo, outside of the roar, are also independent attacks in his moveset. The move where he tramples towards and through you and then jump flops back in your direction can happen at any point without the roar, which is why it's kind of strange that this whole combo seems like a pretty big important thing, but each individual part is reused in different ways. Now lastly, we have his ultimate move, which is telegraphed by him stomping around and throwing a tantrum while the arena becomes slightly purple. You'll want to sprint away from this move and outside of the AoE, and then you can just walk out the lightning as long as you're not healing like an idiot like I did here, and then wait for his next move, which is a giant mouth open jumping slam that this too you'll want to get distance from and then jump over or dodge the after effect. To play it most safe, you should back dodge pretty far outside of this attack and then use the jump to maybe close the distance and get a couple hits in. Now moving on to Gnoster. I think one of the more efficient ways to go about learning this boss fight is less by learning the moves themselves all that thoroughly, and instead having a more appropriate strategy to deal with this boss. The inherent gank makes it kind of a mess, and you don't really need to perfect much as long as you know how to avoid everything. And there's one really simple way to go about doing that, and that's to simply dodge through every attack by the scorpion enemy. If you can get to his ass, then you can pretty much use the same timing for all of his moves, because he'll have moved past the point of his hitboxes. And at that point, it takes him a little bit of time to turn all the way around, which means you can do one of 2 things. You can either attack him directly on his ass or legs, or you can move on to begin attacking the moth, which is what I recommend. Due to the gank nature of this fight, the moth will almost always be throwing an attack at you during any opening you have on the scorpion. And so to somewhat counter this, you can kind of do a hit and run tactic by dodging through the scorpion's attacks and then addressing the moth more directly. dodging whatever move it has and then applying damage, before turning around and repeating the process. And so here are the moves that you have to know in order to effectively apply this method. Starting with the Scorpion's Foot Stomp, this move is best dodged through to give yourself the most leniency on its after effect with the stones. And if you're on the tail end of the bug, it's pretty easy to stay outside of its range. Next, there's the Scorpion's Roar, which in phase 1 precedes it burrowing into the ground. This attack has a distinct audio cue. In fact, a lot of these attacks in this fight have audio cues, either on the Moth or the Scorpion, which somewhat helps with the gank aspects, but it's still kind of a pain in the ass. You'll definitely want to be able to identify the roar because it stays in phase 2 and it deals quite a bit of damage for just a sound attack. Next, for the Moth's attacks, we have this 6 magic projectile attack, which you can dodge in 2 bursts, the first 4 and then the second 2. The Moth also has a area of effect rain of projectiles, which at first glance you might want to make distance from, but actually acts as a pretty significant opening if you can manage the attack effectively. This attack makes the Scorpion go invulnerable and sit in place, which means you only have to deal with the Moth at that point, and that's pretty nice. Should get you at least a couple of hits in. The Moth will also be deploying a bunch of crowd control measures in the form of this poison mist, which can happen in a V shape that you can back out of if you're too close to roll through, or if you're close enough to the Moth, it'll try to encapsulate you in a circle of the mist, trapping you and forcing you to deal with the Scorpion's attacks more directly. Now lastly, for phase 1, the Moth has a grab move, which is telegraphed by this little dance it does, and I failed here in the footage, at which point the Moth wrapped me up and stuck this little pink thing on the back of my neck, some sort of cocoon or something, I don't know. But it does poison you. However, one trick that I learned is that while playing as the Sekiro character, I could just alt to get rid of it. Now on to phase 2. Phase 2 will begin with both the bugs merging, becoming one entity. However, they still retain the ability to independently attack you with different moves, at least to an extent. It seems like most moves have an aspect of poison or projectile to them alongside the Scorpion's melees. This initial starting phase 2 move is the ult of this boss, in which the two will dash at you while firing projectiles before the Scorpion stops and uses a ground pound of stones alongside a series of projectiles from the Moth. This move is arguably best dealt with by roll spamming and hoping, with your starting point being about the moment that the first barrage of projectiles is fired at you. From there, you can kind of just hope that everything lines up, including the moment that the Scorpion attempts to dash past you, which can deal damage, and hopefully the stones as well. There's just far too much going on with this attack to really think about it any other way than spam dodges. From there, your strategy can be much the same as it was in phase 1. Where your only goal is to essentially remain at the backside of the Scorpion and get the most leniency when dodging his stomp moves. This strategy is potentially even more valuable in phase 2 because the stomp moves are now accompanied by poison from the Moth, and occasionally a laser beam from the sky, which you'll have to be aware of and can be burst sprinted away from before it can actually activate and hit you. This strategy is especially effective at keeping you away from these hazards, and if you have the Ice Storm modifier to your sprint, you can deal a ton of ice damage in the process of running in between his attacks. The only attacks you really have to watch out for other than that can potentially happen when you get separated from the boss, including a multi-shot of projectiles followed by a melee, and also the phase 2 variant of the rain of magic projectiles that the Moth did in phase 1, which is preceded by a combo from the Scorpion. As well as that, you'll also have to keep an ear out for the roar attack, which signifies that the phase 2 ult is incoming. But that about sums it up for Gnoster. Next up we have the Augur, which is an incredibly simple fight when you break it down. He has very few moves. Let's knock out the basic ones, which include a wave, which he can throw at you, an AoE of what looks like wind, like a whirlwind of water, and a spinning attack which dashes at you, which you should position yourself at the end of in order to get some significant damage and posture damage in. In phase 1, this will just be one spin attack, but in phase 2, he does 2 in a row, and so make sure to keep that into account in order to get your positioning right. Lastly, within his basic moveset, he has a sleep attack where he takes a nap on the battlefield, causing your sleep to increase unless you stagger him out of it, which is a pretty easy thing to do, but you should note the telegraph of this move and understand it well so that way you can push this move the second you see it coming, and give yourself the most leniency to stagger him out of this attack. Now this is where the rest of the mechanics of this fight come into play, which are really pretty gimmicky, but once you understand them, you kind of see where this fight was coming from. Most people end up just using range for this fight, but I would argue that you're better off doing the opposite. I would argue you're better off with sweeping attacks or AoE style of damage, which is why I chose to switch things up and play as Wilder for this run, whose basic sword, when one-handed, is able to sweep and hit a bunch of enemies at once, which is perfect for when the Augur spawns these jellyfish. You see, the jellyfish that you kill spawn a projectile, and that projectile returns to the boss and deals damage. And it's not a ton of damage, but it is enough posture damage to knock this thing out of the sky pretty easily. And if you're close enough, you can get the critical, at which point you should definitely apply that critical with a lightning damage. The way that the Augur's lightning weakness works is that it will apply a damage over time to the boss, which is absolutely perfect for a boss that's flying above the arena for the entire fight. And so your mindset for this Nightlord has to be a lot different. You should absolutely prioritize being able to crowd control, more so than actually dealing damage to the boss, even though there are opportunities to straight up melee the boss, which supplement that with more damage and more posture damage. Things like the Sacred Relic Sword or Mohg's Sacred Spear will all be invaluable for this fight. I should also note that killing any of the sea anemone arms will also spawn the same projectiles that the jellyfish have, and the sleep nuke orbs that the boss will spawn occasionally. Once killed, will spawn large projectiles, which assumedly do more damage and more posture damage to the boss. Wilder turned out to be pretty clutch for this because his crossbow was able to do enough damage that I could one-hit the orb as soon as it got within melee range. And so this fight is ultimately just a really simple loop of kill adds, knock the enemy out of the sky, apply lightning, wash, rinse, repeat, with little moments of melee damage in between. And that about sums it up. And now we have Libra, a boss I refuse to make a deal with after getting cucked so many times by his raid. The first of his moves is a single overhead sweep. This move will always be a single hit, so don't be afraid to go for an opening after it. His next, however, is similar, but it's quicker, and it's more of a straight vertical slam. While he can do this move alone, there's also an alternate version where he starts with this move and then does a frenzy gun and follows up by another melee, which looks very similar to his last overhead sweep. And so a shorthand for his melee moveset is that if you see the overhead sweep, you can go in for a short opening. His next move will start by sliding his staff against the ground and then following it up with a frenzied gun, another opening you can punish, so long as you recognize that it's not the previous combo. Now, following this move, we have a 3-hit combo that I found to be pretty rare. Consists of 3 standard melees, and afterwards you can get a small opening. And the last of his melees is another one that I found to be rare, which is, I believe, supposed to be a back punish, where he spins around and then sweeps his staff at you. I was only able to find one instance of this in my footage, so I imagine it's rare. Next, we have a 4-hit combo, which is one of the more common and one of the best to deal damage on. To master this move, you'll have to first recognize the telegraph of him two-handing his weapon and holding it above his head before swinging once, then swinging again quickly with a limited telegraph, delaying, swinging again, and then finally, this combo ends in a large overhead slam, and if you positioned yourself correctly next to him, you can avoid the damage entirely, and begin charging a heavy or using a sword art, something larger than your standard opening within this fight. Now, lastly, within his basic melee moveset, we have 2 moves that will only trigger if you're at range from him. The first being this staff slam that can be followed up with a frenzy attack, and the second being a ram headbutt. That really catches you off guard, it's pretty quick, and is the only time he'll use his horns to deal damage. With his basic melee moves out of the way, we can begin talking about his coin moves or frenzy moves, including his frenzy gun, which involves him shaking his coins in his hand and then tossing them outward, which ends in an opening if you dodge past it. His next is a frenzy AoE that spawns on you and is telegraphed by him crushing the coins in his hand. This attack can either be avoided with a careful and well-timed dodge, or you could just burst sprint and you'll be out of the range before it shows up. And the last is a frenzied showering effect, where he throws the coins into the air. Now lastly, within his non-special frenzy moves, he has a frenzy teleport, where he spawns a circle around him and then slams his staff down, which relocates him somewhere, and if he relocates himself onto you, he will deal damage similar to the frenzied circle that he spawns on you when he crushes the coins. I should also note that in Phase 2, any frenzy guns he spawns will become stationary rotating turrets and are really fucking annoying. I'm not sure what they were thinking when they implemented this. They last wholly too long, Maybe you can break them, I don't know. Now, lastly, we have his special moves, starting with this meditation, which you can break him out of to prevent him from entering phase 2. Breaking him out of this, however, will increase his attack and send him into this frenzy where he'll hit you with his jump move a million times, ending with him shattering the ground and throwing frenzy juices everywhere, followed by him raining those juices down from the sky. However, at some point you will fail the meditation mechanic, and he will power up with a defense boost and essentially activate phase 2, which is the mechanic that allows him to place the stationary turrets on his frenzy guns. And lastly, he has his ult, which I'm kind of unsure of how to beat. I believe that this one hit of damage is the main thing you have to worry about, and from there you can focus on hitting with charged heavies and knocking him out of it. Probably. But I never really managed to do it without taking frenzy and the hit and dying. The only footage I have is when I was in my ult and just managed to survive it. But the bright side is that after this move is completed, he loses his phase 2 buff and reverts back to his phase 1 state with standard frenzy guns. But at that point, the fight should pretty much be over. Next up, we have Fulghor, a boss that I see as remarkably simple, actually, which is kind of surprising. His first attack is a single jumping slam. It's pretty easily telegraphed and ends with a pretty standard opening. Next we have his hoof slam, which honestly catches me off guard because it looks more like a telegraph than an actual move itself. You'll have to be quick to recognize it's incoming. Next up, we have another very simple one-hit move that involves a telegraph with him running to the side and then slicing his weapon across the ground into a sweep. Then we finally get a 2-hit combo, a single hit followed by a wind attack. Again, very straightforward, but this time we get the introduction of the wind mechanic, where these attacks will send out a wave of damage that you might not even recognize existed if you had fought him close up until that point. I know I sure didn't. Although in my opinion, these attacks' projectiles are well designed and intuitive. Now these wind attacks come in 2 forms. First, the single move, and next the 3-hit combo. And they're all telegraphed pretty well, so it'll only take a handful of attempts to get them down. And that's it for his basic melee moveset, all of which gives you some opening of attack afterwards. Next, we'll be getting into his phase 2 juice arm attacks, the first of which starts at phase 2 and is a large jumping slam with a huge AoE. This is the kind of move that you'll want to dodge not early, but very close to the second that it lands. The entirety of the attack is one move. And this can also happen throughout phase 2, it's not just his intro phase. Next we have a single hit move that is telegraphed by him spinning his body around before swinging one juicy attack at you, with a wide forward-reaching range. His next attack is a 2-hit combo where he'll raise his hoofs into the air before slamming quickly and then following the combo with a sweep of his arm, similar to the previous move. This can be a pretty awkward telegraph because the boss's arm raised up is often higher than your screen, so you're gonna have to just kind of read his movements, more so than seeing what his arm is doing at any one time. His next combo is going to have his juice arm held more horizontal, which is a 4-hit combo, a sweep, a delay, 2 hits, and then a slam, which you can more or less survive if you just spam dodges into him and then time your last one to the final slam. This move gives you a pretty big opening, but only if you reach the final slam. If you're too far out of his range, he will cancel the move, instead only doing a 2-hit combo. Now we move on to his special moves, starting with his glaive charge slam, which if you hit him during this animation, he will bind you and make it so that you're fat rolling for a short duration. This move can be successfully avoided by making distance and then timing your dodge immediately after his glaive hits the ground. Take note that I said after his glaive hits the ground. You can also use his weakness mechanic and hit him with lightning during this animation, which cancels his bind animation and knocks him down, and also gives him the damage over time that the Augur had with its lightning weakness. However, the damage over time lasts a significant time, which means that you can't reapply it until it's over. And so you'll likely see this move another time before you have the chance to reapply his weakness. Therefore, you should be ready to avoid the move at least every other time you see it. Now, lastly, we'll have his ultimate move, which is telegraphed by him stomping a little bit and then charging across the arena, leaving a holy trail. Now, you're going to want to dodge into the holy trail for his second pass, and this does a couple of things for you. For one, this makes it so that his third pass is going to be very quick, and that is a downside. You'll have to dodge very quickly at that point, but for whatever reason, the positioning that you'll have after that point you basically won't have to avoid his final hit whatsoever. You'll either be outside of its range or outside of the shape of it in some way. So just remember to dodge into the first wave and then dodge quickly on his third pass and you should be fine. Now that's Fulghor, so let's move on to Caligo, starting with his breath attacks. First his straight breath, which if you can dodge behind, it's a great opening to start hitting his head, but his breath attacks can also have a follow-up with his wing very rarely. One thing that Caligo likes to do is make a distance with his flying dash and then use that distance to force you to deal with his breath attacks. Now, these breath attacks are not exactly what they would seem. The mist that surrounds them is much larger than the actual hitbox of the attack itself. And so you kind of have to have nerves of steel and face down the ice and get into it before you start dodging, but only slightly so. Now he also has a down breath attack which surrounds him with an AoE, and the telegraph for this is very similar to the first bit of his straight breath, however has a considerably longer telegraph, which you'll have to use that time to identify it and then get out of there. Next, moving on to his more basic melees, he has a 2-hit melee attack, which is pretty standard, but it's kind of hard to see sometimes when you're not exactly looking at his arms. And he also has a rare but tricky bite combo, which begins to attack very fast and then can follow up with breath and a wing attack. Next, onto his tail moves, he's got a slam attack, which is a bit delayed, and a sweeping attack. Now this sweep attack is a single attack, but can be upgraded later on, and I'm gonna have to enter speculation for a moment, but I believe that this ice move, which is otherwise kind of innocuous, powers up Caligo and gives him alternate powered up versions of his move, which, my first time fighting him, I knocked him out of with fire damage, I believe. See, the alternate version of this sweep becomes a 2-hit combo with 2 charged ice swings, the second seemingly expending an ice blast of wind. I believe that's part of his weakness mechanic, but like I said, I'm just speculating. I only have like 2 attempts worth of footage here, so let me know if I'm wrong. Next we have his icy wing beat attacks, which are kind of awkward. You don't necessarily have to dodge them to dodge them, you can just walk away. But sometimes if you dodge them, they enter into a combo, potentially a combo buffed by his superior icy state. This combo is pretty extensive and ends with him creating an ice nuke out of a bunch of icebergs he spawned with breath, but ultimately just uses the same timings as his base tail slam. Next, let's talk about his ultimates. There are 1 of 2 in which he will fly into the air spinning away and the whole map will be covered in a deep fog. In this variant, Caligo will begin sucking in ice and will spawn several ice pillars, which he will then shatter with a wave of breath that you'll have to dodge through. And then he'll likely have made enough distance in the process of doing this ultimate move that he'll come at you with a giant flying breath attack slam, which you should treat just like a slamming melee and dodge accordingly. Every time I tried to dodge the breath, I got hit by his body itself. Now next, there's the same template used for his next attack, which is using a spin to fly away, filling the arena with fog, and then freezing the entire sky and shattering it, dropping ice chunks on you. That's kind of a really difficult telegraph to see, and so all I can really say to help you time it is that you should absolutely wait until after the smooth ice sheet breaks before you start dodging. You have to wait for the spindly, root-like structures to come down on you to actually dodge the attack. And again, after this move, he'll likely do the flying breath slam. Now, his last ultimate move turns him into a fighter jet, flying around the map and firing machine guns of ice at you, strafing through several passes before finally landing, and then performing an icy barrage that makes Estelle's meteors look reasonable. I'm not sure how you're supposed to avoid this attack other than just using a shield or spam dodging. But that's pretty much it for Caligo. On to the final Nightlord boss, the Nightlord. Now, the Nightlord only has a couple really basic moves, one of which is this phase 1 only variant, which is a large delayed thrust that ends in a pretty big opening. The other is this single one-hit combo that I only saw once, and of course surprised me so much I died to it. He will also have this large jumping slam, which he only really uses if you're at range, and so therefore is also very rare. And so now we get into his real combos, starting with his roaring shoulder charge combo. This is a really significant source of damage across your whole run. The roar is an instant, immediate telegraph to know that this move is coming, and that is highly valuable, because a lot of his other moves are basic sword attacks in one way or another. And so once you have identified that the roar is happening and therefore the shoulder charge is incoming, which you'll have to kind of pre-dodge, he comes at you pretty quick, you can then get the hang of the rest of the move, which includes 2 attacks that should miss if you've dodged through his shoulder charge, a 3rd attack that you have to dodge, and then a 4th attack that feigns an opening before hitting a 2-hit combo that can really catch you off guard if you go for that opening. Only wait until after that attack to deal damage. Now next we have a backhanded slice followed by a thrusting attack. And the interesting thing about this attack is that it can also be triggered as a back punish. It's one of the few attacks that he'll do when you're not facing him. And so it's worth getting the timing down and recognizing that if there's an attack coming when he's not facing you, it's likely this. Now next we have what I call the flop sword combo, based on him flopping his sword back and forth like that, where he does 2 swings and a thrust. But there's also another variant where he does the 2nd swing and then the thrust, which might be slightly more delayed, which can completely throw you off. And next we'll get into some of the ultra greatsword moves, including this combo. Starts with 2 big swings, which kind of act as roll catches if you don't perfect dodge them, and it eventually ends with a giant delayed swing, which you can punish. What makes this attack especially difficult is that there is another generic greatsword combo, which is this one here with, again, 2 big greatsword swings, a swing away, and then a thrust. Almost as if he's canceling what would have been the other attack and instead finishing the move with a thrust, which might be based on you being farther ranged, I'm not sure. The last of his combos comes down to a backhanded regular sword slice, a follow-up, and then a delayed greatsword swing. I believe the same swing that's used on his other greatsword combos, which is kind of why a lot of these combos become very difficult. They intersplice their different moves together, kind of confusing you as to what is what. So next we'll get into his magic moves, starting with this magically charged thrust, which creates a wave of AoE, which is then followed up by a very delayed overhead slam that might make you want to deal damage in between, but I would highly recommend against it. What you should do instead is back dodge and step away as much as possible, so that way when you enter into his next slam, you're dodging into the wave, which should help you avoid the move completely more often. Now next we have a very satisfying spin move with a really good telegraph, and these moves act as projectiles, I believe. They throw projectiles off of the blade. But up close, they're easy enough to dodge twice, and then you want to position yourself away from him for this thrust, and then back dodge into it so that you're close enough to him to get a sizable opening by the time his move is done. Next we have one of his ultimate moves, in which it looks like he's crying or praying and spawns a bunch of these seeking projectiles. I had a hard time with this at first, but I found that if I position myself somewhat close to him and then begin sprinting away as they spawn, and then kind of do an arcing motion back to him, the orbs would explode before they could get to me for some reason. Now onto his true ultimate form. We first have this explosion that he spawns, which again looks like one single explosion but is a wave of damage. And so I found it best to deal with this by positioning myself as close as possible to him for the final hit, and then dodging it more or less like the hit itself is the attack. Now after this point he's going to be elementally buffed by a certain amount by a random elemental type based on which portal he cut through. And at this point only his single sword is going to be buffed with this damage, which means only his basic combos are really going to have after effects on them. But for the duration of this attack, his greatsword oriented attacks are going to be more or less the same. But in order to effectively dodge both the attacks and the follow-ups, I found it best to begin sprinting away from him more or less. Keep your distance as much as possible, and then early dodge on all of his attacks, and then use a second follow-up dodge almost immediately to avoid the after effect. This is kind of hard to do as you're fighting your own intuition to do it, and all the skills you've built up until this point, but with a little practice you should avoid most of the after effects. The only one that might get you is the straight attack, which follows his thrust move, which you'll have to try to train yourself to dodge to the right. His right hand sword sends it out, and so the after effect will be more positioned towards your left. Now after this point, he's going to spawn his ultimate finishing move, where he expends this extra power. And I would definitely recommend just learning the timing of this move and getting close so as to not have to deal with the untelegraphed after effects that cover a wide area. This attack is essentially 2 hits, a delay, 2 hits, a delay, and then a single hit, and then his ultimate final slam. And that is about all there is to it. Hopefully this all helped you out. If it didn't, and this was a pain in the ass to make, and I could have been playing the Lies of P DLC this whole time, so that sucks. Anyway.
Thank you.